asking me to give this specific lecture. In fact, you have been asking me for a little while. I was somehow dodging it. I think it's good that I'm able to do it today. My homage to Professor Lakhan Mahapatra. I have met him first time in 1977 when he visited ISEC Bangalore. In fact, he fell ill at that time during that workshop. But I had good interactions with him. He was a wonderful person. And what I'm talking today is also closely related to the areas of work that he has done on rehabilitation, resettlement, and those areas. So basically, when I'm talking about the marginal communities, we all know the marginal communities are largely pushed to the margins by the political powers or the other kinds of processes, economic and other processes. It's all because the kinds of resources they were holding, they were very important for the for exploitation, for their national growth or economic growth, what they call. And so therefore I thought I should discuss about in this particular lecture on marginal communities, covering both rural and urban locales, because for me, marginal communities, whether they're rural or urban, they structurally belong to the same level. And I also would like to see the relationship of marginal communities with the resources and how their livelihoods are shaped by those relationships. And in fact, we also should know the there is a kind of ideological contrast. That is, they are basically individualistic versus the communitarian, because we are more individualistic, or we were communitarian earlier, but we became individualistic. So they are more communitarian. So we find that contrast in terms of ideological understandings. That is where all our programs, policies, and other things, why they fail is also one of the reasons. And another important thing that we all understand as anthropologists is that traditional marginal communities, they always held resources in common. And they always had some kind of a cultural knowledge about the resources. So the customary institutions basically were regulating the management of these resources. That is because if anybody violates, that kind of violation is regulated through the customary institutions, or what we call the kinds of councils, traditional councils or village councils or whatever they are. And another important dimension that I would like to also touch upon today is the way they looked at nature is different from the way we look at it today. Nature for them is common for all creations and not exclusively for human beings. So that means they always considered there as a part of nature, not something only beings existing in nature. So that means every creature in the nature has a right to exist. And therefore, they were very prudent in using the resources. And that is where we find there is a contrast in terms of the outlook of the marginal communities with the resources and the way they manage these resources, because the resources that they have a knowledge about the resources, they use that knowledge to basically earn their living, because the natural resources are important for them. If they survive, their livelihoods can continue. If they continue, they can exist. And that means it's a question of linkage of livelihoods with the knowledge and with the resources. Any break in any of them, one of them, will lead to disasters for them. This is exactly what has been happening. And in this context, we should also look at the way the development is taken up. I would always call the development as anti-marginal. or that includes, when I say marginal communities, includes tribal communities, the rural, uh, uh, you know, marginal service communities, because like scheduled castes and also the some of the low rung OBCs. Among the other backward castes, there are better off people, but among the OBCs, service communities are really poor. And in fact, you will also find, partly when we define it much more broadly, the minorities also belong to marginal communities. But that I'm not going to touch upon much today. Now, we are talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, my point is whether sustainable development without the participation of the marginal communities, is it possible? Without taking the marginal communities' perspectives, is sustainable development possible? These are the issues that I would like to talk about today. Now, when I'm saying the rural and urban, I just want to give you a broad picture of that before I go into the concerns of anthropological kind. When I say rural and urban, I'm talking about marginal means I'm talking about the poor. The rural and urban poor, they can be differentiated based on the very nature of the livelihoods and based on the living conditions. But both of them structurally belong to the same order. When I'm saying the structurally belongs to the same order, they are, they are in line with the kind of livelihood that they take up. They are in line with the kinds of living conditions that they are in. And when you look at the urban poor practice a variety of avocations in order to earn their living. And most of the time we find the urban poor or the marginal communities in urban areas live in highly unhealthy conditions, and mostly they live in congested slums. They live on pavements, they live on low-lying and waterlogged areas. They also live alongside the drainages and whatever you have. In other words, their conditions are virtually similar when you look at in the rural also. Rural, they may be not so worse off as compared to in urban, but structurally they belong to the same order. So what we find is in urban areas, the proliferation of slums is because of lack of any provision for these people to live in urban areas. Interesting thing is, they are brought into urban areas in order to build the infrastructure, build everything in urban areas. But they don't have a place in it. It is something very contradictory. So another important thing that we must remember in this context is increase in the movement of rural poor to urban places is also a kind of a commentary on the general deterioration of conditions of living for the marginal communities in the rural areas. Otherwise, why would they migrate? And it is also a kind of a commentary on the increasing crisis in agriculture and rural economy. So this is one thing that we must remember, why rural migration, rural to urban migration takes place is just because of this. So that means there is a direct link between development and impoverishment of the, I would call the marginal communities basically as resource rich poor. It's contradictory. Resource rich, but they are poor. That means they live in resource rich areas. They never had, like for example, tribal areas, you won't find any pattas or anything. They were living there for centuries. And the revenue fellows try and say that you don't have any pattas, so you are illegal. The forest department declared them as illegal. The British wanted to take over their forest and the forest resources. So in other words, what we find is these resource rich poor had no other way than to migrate to urban centers because of the way development has impoverished many of them. And this is also another factor is the increasing stress on establishing industries, expanding housing, urban infrastructure, etc. Now we all know how real estate business also booms in this. So all this requires the labor of the poor or the marginal communities. In a sense, what I'm saying is the crisis in rural economy actually has shifted to urban places whose tempo is accelerated after economic liberalization. This is one thing we must remember that. Now, in urban places, land prices have soared up. Maybe earlier, possibly they were not so this thing. So poor could somehow live on the places which are public or government lands, etc. But no longer that is possible. And in fact, the prices of the urban resources have gone up so much. It is difficult for even the middle classes. Forget about the marginal communities. So, which means cities or even small towns are growing vertically because they can't grow horizontally. They are growing vertically,